Hi everyone. There's a phrase I've been hearing more and more frequently, which is we have the same evidence, but we're just drawing different conclusions. Now, to someone who doesn't really understand the scientific method, the subject material, or how evidence works, this might sound like a good way to say, yes, I do have evidence to support my beliefs. But the problem is that anyone who does understand those things can immediately see that it's a big problem. What I'm going to use for an example today is this idea of a worldwide flood, which is found in the Torah, the Bible, and the Quran, and how just understanding the subject material or just understanding the scientific method will easily clear any of this up. I'm going to be reading from Answers in Genesis Genesis's website because they provide 6 pieces of evidence, or what they believe is pieces of evidence, or are pieces of evidence for this. So first, we have to talk about the scientific method. And the way that I describe that to my students is that it's not some weird abstract concept that's restricted to people in lab coats hanging out in research facilities. It's just a way for us to understand that the ideas or beliefs that we have formed are in line with reality. And it doesn't have to be esoteric. It doesn't have to be some weird concept about reality or anything like that. It can be pretty simple stuff. And so I always give the example of baking cookies. So we start off with the scientific method with observation or question. And in this case, the observation or question is, hey, I've got a little bit of excess fat. What can I do about that? So we go to the research stage, and I find out from all of my reading that everybody basically agrees the more calories that I eat, the more weight that I'll gain. And that has scientific research to support it, so I can say that this is probably an accurate thing. So let's go ahead and create a hypothesis. Well, I like to eat cookies. Is there a way to make cookies that have fewer calories? Okay. So I'm going to experiment. I'm going to take out something that's high calorie from the cookies, such as flour, white flour, and replace it with something that has fewer calories, such as oat fiber or protein powder. Now I do the experiment. I whip up this batch of cookies, I replace it 1 for 1. Maybe I do an extra step and try to see, can white flour and oat fiber be replaced 1 for 1? Can it not? Is there any accommodation that I have to make for that? And I form my cookie dough, I bake my cookies, and now it's time to collect the data. So I give out the cookies to all my friends and family, and I ask them to write down what they feel or tell me what they feel. And now I have to analyze this data. Do people feel good eating these cookies? Is it a good texture? Is it a good taste? And if everybody says no, then my conclusion is I did replace accurately, or I was able to create cookies that were lower calorie, but however, it's nothing that I would ever want to eat. So let's go back to the experiment or the hypothesis and go back from there and start over. And so I can make myself something that's really tasty. And that's really what it is. It's nothing that's abstract or strange. We do it all the time. If you guys like cooking, there's a lot of substitutions that you may make in the kitchen, and you find out, yes, some of them totally work, and no, some of them totally don't work. And you might even have a food blog and you share about it, or you just make a joke on Twitter, or you post a picture of a failed cooking experiment on Instagram, and everybody has a good laugh. But it's still the scientific method. It's a really valuable tool. So if we go to Answers in Genesis on their webpage, Worldwide Flood, Worldwide Evidence, this is what they start off with. When the Bible refers to a worldwide flood in Genesis 7 through 8, that's exactly what it means. Not local, not metaphorical, not some crazy dream. The waters covered the whole earth. Don't just take our word for it, though. Take a look at the evidence right beneath your feet. Now, when you tell me that the waters covered the whole earth, there's some conclusions that we can already draw. Number 1, things are going to die. Number 2, things are going to get mixed around. Now, if you know stuff about water and the way that things settle in water, things like density and so forth, then reasonable expectations will be things like a bunch of animal skeletons will be mixed together. The rock layers will be deposited as huge rocks on the bottom and smaller rocks, and so on, until only the top layer is going to be the tiniest little rock pieces, the finest sediment. And we don't find either of those things. So right away we can just say this doesn't even need to go to the experimentation phase. We already know that it can stop in the research phase. We don't have to create a hypothesis. If you want to create a hypothesis, you can. The hypothesis would be something like we would find cats and dogs mixed in with Tyrannosaurus bones. And then we'd go and find that that never has happened. We've never found such a thing. Therefore, we cannot conclude that such a thing would have happened because we would have seen it. But let's go ahead and check out what they have to say. So evidence 1, fossils of sea creatures high above sea level due to ocean waters having flooded over the continents. We find the fossils of sea creatures in rock layers that covers all the continents. For example, most of the rock layers in the walls of the Grand Canyon, more than a mile above sea level, contain marine fossils. Fossilized shellfish are even found in the Himalayas. And this is absolutely true. Again, we have the same evidence, right? But the thing is, I'm starting from a point of how did this get there? Whereas they're starting from a point of, I believe in a worldwide flood. Is there anything that I can find to possibly support that concept? The problem with taking Genesis literally is that we start off with a world that's about 6,000 or so years old. I'm not sure how people like this would account for mountains. I know that in the Quran it says that the mountains are pegs placed by Allah to keep the earth from shaking, which of course the same process that makes mountains also makes earthquakes, so that doesn't really work out too well. So the idea, I suppose, is that the mountains were created with the earth as just sort of a fun, bumpy feature, I guess. But if we actually study it, if we understand radiometric dating at all, for example, then we can understand that this was some pretty old stuff. And if we understand how plate tectonics work, if we understand that the Himalayan mountains are getting taller every year because of plate tectonics, that they're still growing, then we can basically figure out that they were a lot lower at another point. And that's true. So when we say, or when the Answers in Genesis says that there's sea creatures high above sea level due to the ocean waters having flooded over the continents, that is a true statement. However, it's not in the same way that they're thinking. It wasn't this thing that happened about 4,000 years ago and all of these marine animals just ended up on top of the mountains. It was ancient oceans, very ancient oceans, that had covered these regions prior to them being elevated to a point that they're above sea level. And again, this isn't some idea that I have. I didn't extrapolate this just because the Himalayas are growing now, so therefore they must have been growing in the past. This is stuff that we can actually date. So it's not just a guess. It's pretty well-established stuff. Evidence 2, rapid burial of plants and animals. We find extensive fossil graveyards and exquisitely preserved fossils. For example, billions of nautiloid fossils are found in a layer within the Redwall limestone of Grand Canyon. This layer was deposited catastrophically by a massive flow of sediment. The chalk and coal beds of Europe and the United States, and the fish Ichthyosaurus, insects, and other fossils all around the world testify of a catastrophic destruction and burial. Now notice what they actually said here. Billions of nautiloid fossils are found in a layer within the Redwall limestone of Grand Canyon. Now, if we had a catastrophic world flood, we wouldn't expect billions of nautiloid fossils. We would expect billions of nautiloid fossils and other stuff. We would expect elephant fossils and camel fossils, koala fossils. We would expect all of those stuck in there as well, and we don't. So I don't know if anybody realized that saying this layer has this animal in it alone or extensively actually disproves exactly what they're trying to prove. So I don't think anybody really caught that. Evidence 3, rapidly deposited sediment layers spread across vast areas. We find that rock layers can be traced all the way across the continents, even between continents. And physical features in those strata indicate that they were deposited rapidly. Now, this keeps saying that they were deposited rapidly over and over again, and I've clicked on other stuff, and I can't find anywhere that they actually have cited that we know that this was immediately deposited or deposited all at once. Again, we would reasonably expect that if it was deposited suddenly over the course of a year, which is what they claim the extent of the flood was for 1 year, we would expect that there would be just a very obvious stratification of sizes, big heavy rocks at the bottom and tiny, tiny bits of sediment at the top layer, and that's not what we find. The reason that these layers can be traced all the way across the continents is because that's how plates work. That's how plate tectonics works. They talk about it all the way across the continents as if the processes of plate tectonics cared about the fact that we've separated things into Europe and Asia. They're gonna be there because that's how plate tectonics works. The layers are going to be pushed up and out and over. Things that are going to be eroded over a large area are going to be eroded over a large area. Weathering does not happen in one specific area. It's going to be pushed over large distances. This is flattened under huge glaciers during the latest ice ages. There's so many other explanations for this. So to jump to this conclusion of this doesn't really make any sense. Now on this evidence 3, it says inclined sloping layers within the Coconino sandstone of the Grand Canyon are a testimony to 10,000 cubic miles of sand being deposited by huge water currents within days. Now I actually looked up the Coconino sandstone of Grand Canyon, and this is what it has to say. Coconino grains are quartz, a mineral both abundant and durable. When rocks and weather erode, many minerals may be present in the resulting sediment. Some of these minerals dissolve, others erode to dust. Usually after blowing in the wind for a very long time, only the sturdy quartz grains remain. These dune quartz grains are very mature, uniform composition, small sand size, very well rounded, and all grains are about the same size. Those features demonstrate the grains' origin in blowing dunes. Sand transported by water never reaches this degree of maturity because water transports sand more slowly than wind, causing less abrasion. To turn a sediment into rock requires a natural glue. Silica and calcimite sediments are the most common. Groundwater introduces these dissolved cements into the sediment. The more cement, the harder the rock. So it's saying that the Coconino sandstone was put there by wind. It couldn't have been put there by water. And then once it was all settled and just kind of built up over large periods of time, then as a river, such as the Colorado River, which is what the evidence points to as being the reason the Grand Canyon exists, as that starts to get in there, then it starts to solidify. So I don't know where they got this idea that the Coconino sandstone is sand being deposited by huge water currents within days. Again, the types of fine sand, uniform sand that's found there isn't something that we see typically. Or rather, something we typically find with a water deposition. So just looking at this stuff, again, people that actually study this, not people that are searching geology textbooks in order to hopefully support their claim, but it's people that just want to know what happened. How did this get here? What does it look like? People that don't have any kind of conclusion that they're trying to fit, they're able to go ahead and look at this and see this is the same process that we see all around the world, and there's no way this could have been dropped by water. Evidence 4, sediment transported long distances. We find that sediments in those widespread, rapidly deposited rock layers, again, there's no evidence that they're providing that this was rapidly deposited, had to be eroded from distant sources and carried long distances by fast-moving water. We've already shown that that's, I don't know any other way to say this, inaccurate, a lie. I'm not sure if they deliberately lied or just made it up and thought that they understood it. I don't know, but we've already talked about how that's not the case. For example, the sand for the Coconino sandstone of Grand Canyon, they keep bringing it up. You think they would have, I don't know, looked it up first. Had to be eroded and transported from the northern portion of what is now the United States and Canada. Furthermore, water current indicators such as ripple marks preserved in rock layers show that for 300 million years, around quotes, the water currents were consistently flowing from the northeast to the southwest across all of North and South America, which of course is only possible over weeks during a global flood. I'm not sure what they mean by that. Because they're saying the evidence that is found because of water current that's in the rock layers, they show that for long periods of time, in this case they say 300 million years, which again is not cited, that the water currents were consistently flowing all across North and South America. And then they say, no, that's only possible over weeks during a global flood. I'm not sure what they mean by this, because the evidence shows X, and they're saying, no, Y. I mean, that's not looking at the evidence and coming to a different conclusion. That's looking at the evidence and saying, I reject it because my conclusion doesn't agree with the evidence. So that's what I was saying about this is not how evidence works. You can't just look at something and then decide that it fits your conclusion if you interpret it a certain way. The evidence points to one thing. You cannot just throw that thing away and throw away that conclusion because it doesn't fit your conclusion. And that's not how evidence works. They provide no possible explanation for why they just said, yes, the evidence shows this has been slow water currents, ripple marks, consistent flow for 300 millions of years, but we're going to say that, no, this took a few weeks during a global flood. There's no explanation given for why they jumped to that conclusion, other than the fact that they already assumed that Genesis is literal. Evidence 5, rapid or no erosion between strata. We find evidence of rapid erosion or even of no erosion between rock layers. Flat, knife-edge boundaries between rock layers indicate continuous deposition of one layer after another with no time for erosion. For example, there is no evidence of any missing millions of years of erosion in the flat boundary between two well-known layers of the Grand Canyon, the Coconino Sandstone and the Hermit Formation. Another impressive example of flat boundaries at Grand Canyon is the Redwall Limestone and strata beneath it. So they're saying that we find evidence of erosion and sometimes not really of erosion. I'm not sure how this points to a global flood at all. Because again, if there was a global flood, we would find large heavy rocks on the bottom and so on to the smallest, finest sediment. When they talk about super fine Coconino Sandstone slapped down somewhere and then on top of it thicker, heavier pieces of rock in other layers, that in no way supports a global flood. I'm not sure what they're talking about. I mean, of course we would expect gradual erosion, rapid erosion, or even no erosion between various layers over the course of millions of years. Of course that would happen. It could be something like the sandstone formed and then a volcano went off and now there's this layer of basalt over it and there wasn't enough erosion, or that there was a bunch of erosion that happened with a glacier moving over something, and as the glacier starts melting, or if the glacier's on something, it builds up and it isn't really moving too much to grate things away, which isn't super common, but as it melts, it's going to deposit all of its loess, for example, or what am I thinking? Moraine that is going to just dump in here. That's what we expect to find. And that is what we find. And those are the explanations for it. We don't have to figure out an explanation. We've understood how this happened because we've asked ourselves, how would this happen? And then we've found out ways that it does happen. I'm not sure why this is something that Answers in Genesis is presenting as super unique or incredibly unexpected. It's very much expected that we would have rapid erosion, no erosion, or slow erosion between different sediment or different layers of rock. Again, melting glaciers, volcanic eruptions. Those are just two right off the top of my head that would completely explain this. It has nothing to do with a massive flood. And again, if there was a flood, we would expect all the heavy stuff on the bottom and the tiniest, lightest particles up at the top, and we do not find that. And finally, evidence 6, many strata laid down in rapid succession. Rocks do not normally bend. They break because they are hard and brittle, but in many places we find whole sequences of strata that are bent without fracturing, indicating that all the rock layers were rapidly deposited and folded while still wet and pliable before final hardening. Again, no evidence of this rapid deposition that they're talking about. There's no links provided. There's no sources provided. However, rocks do not normally bend. That does not mean they never bend. Now, you can make rocks soft and pliable by heat, pressure, heat and pressure. And one really cool thing about the Earth is that it's really hot and it's really heavy. This, again, if I seem like I'm in disbelief or struggling for words out of disbelief, it's because I am. Again, I studied geology. So, and I didn't even study it in any super serious capacity. I studied it as part of my degree, but my degree is not in geology. So for somebody like me to just immediately know this is completely wrong, it indicates that they've in no way attempted to understand the material. They've in no way consulted any kind of experts. Because anybody who knows anything about rocks knows that they become pliable when heat and or pressure is applied, and that the Earth is just a big old heat and pressure machine in terms of plate tectonics. So this suggestion that rocks can only bend if they were dropped rapidly and folded up while they were still wet and pliable before final hardening. Do they know anything about how this stuff happens? This is why you cannot say you have the same evidence and just drew a different conclusion. Because somebody with the evidence being these rocks are folded, they would then go to, this is the part where I said they don't understand how evidence works. So you would look at this bit of evidence, rocks are folded, and then you would try to figure out under which conditions would rocks fold. To come up with the conclusion that they can only be bent while still wet and pliable before final hardening indicates absolutely no effort whatsoever put into understanding the evidence. That's frustrating. It's so frustrating, even my cat is meowing outside the door because of how much their head is hurting. For example, the Tapiat sandstone in Grand Canyon is folded at a right angle, 90 degrees, without evidence of breaking, yet this folding could only have occurred after the rest of the layers have been deposited, supposedly over 480 million years, while the Tapiat sandstone remained wet and pliable. There's no reason that they have to be wet and pliable, and I'm really confused at why they keep talking about only sandstone. Other layers exist. It's really shocking because, I glanced through these evidence claims before making this video. I didn't really go through it a whole lot. I did look up the Coconino sandstone because it was specifically cited, but I just kind of glanced through it to make sure that, I understand this stuff, but to actually sit here and read through it very specifically to understand what they're trying to say, and to understand how they're grossly misrepresenting the evidence and made zero effort whatsoever to even try to understand the evidence. It's disgusting. It's a serious affront to education, the fact that we have so much knowledge that has been put together for us, and then to just completely disregard it, to look at whatever your book says. That's really frustrating. And then it says, what now? The Bible's history is reliable throughout, from creation of man from the dust of the ground, which, again, no links to support that validity, to the worldwide flood, to the coming of Jesus Christ. But just reading the evidence isn't enough. The message of salvation founded in the Bible's history is also true, and God wants us to accept the gift of salvation He freely offers us. The evidence is real. God has revealed Himself to us in His Word and in His creation. Romans 1:20, how we respond. I mean, all that's here, even all that's linked is basically the worldwide flood. And assuming any of this is true, and assuming they interpreted the evidence correctly instead of literally just making up what they think the evidence could mean. I mean, geology is a really well-established field of science. I mean, this is not like a new science thing that we're not really sure and we can just kind of make it up as we go along because we don't have the answers yet. I mean, this is pretty solid stuff, not to make a geology joke. But let's assume that their conclusions drawn here are accurate and that it points to a worldwide flood. Why Christianity? I mean, the Torah has a worldwide flood. The Quran has a worldwide flood. Why is it just Christianity that I'm forced to accept now? How is telling me about the flood, which, let's pretend for argument's sake, was a historical event that was written down, why does that now mean the whole Bible is true? Why does that now mean all of the supernatural claims in the Bible, the God, man, Jesus, and salvation, and all of that? How does that mean that it's true? And so this is, again, what I meant by people who say we have the same evidence, we just drew different conclusions, don't understand how evidence works. It does not logically follow that if a worldwide flood happened, Jesus exists. It doesn't follow. It doesn't follow that if a worldwide flood happened, the whole Bible is historically accurate, or that an all-knowing creator exists. That's not how evidence works. If we have evidence of a worldwide flood, which, again, as we've seen, this in no way points to, if we had that evidence, it would be evidence of a worldwide flood. We couldn't further extrapolate from that to go from a flood that dropped stuff, which apparently was limited to the Coconino Sandstone Foundation, apparently, sandstone formation, to something supernatural, that a single God exists, and it's a male God, and it created stuff, and it knows who you are, and it cares about who you are, and it sends itself as its own son, as a human, but it wasn't, and something about salvation because there was a sacrifice which wasn't actually a sacrifice. I mean, none of it actually makes sense. None of it follows if the evidence pointed to a worldwide flood, which it doesn't. So hopefully this has shown just how simply somebody who was formally educated in a small way can immediately see such huge glaring errors to the points that I'm only forced to conclude they in no way consulted any experts on the subject. They in no way attempted to even analyze the evidence. Again, the rock concept of the rocks bending, if you just take 5 seconds to Google that, you would easily find all kinds of, even videos of people heating and adding pressure to rocks and then they bend. In no way does it have to do with wet and pliable rock. And it's troubling that not only is this presented, but that there are people that lack such a science education, that they accept this. They accept this stuff that is, again, not supported in any meaningful way. It's not cited in any meaningful way. If there's citations, because all of these claims of evidence, they all have like bigger articles to go to. If you actually look at them, it's just a bunch of claims and then a bunch of stuff listed at the end as sources, but none of them are directly cited in the actual writing. So you have no idea where they took this from. This source that they use could have just been to use it for a definition. But because they don't specifically cite it and they just say, oh yeah, we wrote all this and then here's some sources that we used, even though we didn't tell you which sources helped us write which thing, then for somebody who doesn't know how to understand a research writing, they're going to see this and think, oh yeah, obviously this is totally supported because they have cited sources. Unfortunately, too, a lot of the sources are books from like the 1970s. And I'm not sure why they use that. I've seen that a lot in creationist stuff. It's these really old books that are hard to find online. So you kind of just have to take their word for it or try to dig up the book. If you guys are interested in me attempting to dig these books up and checking them out, that might be kind of interesting. But, you know, science didn't stop in the 1970s. I don't know why they have to pick it out from that. I would wager if I was a betting person, I would bet that they did that because it's deliberately difficult for people to verify. It makes it look like they're supporting themselves without any practical way to verify it. And that's, you know, if that's true, that's really awful. But, I mean, seeing what they've come up with, I mean, that's pretty awful too. Anyway, if you guys have any stuff that you did want me to talk about specifically about different kinds of situations where they say the evidence supports their conclusion rather than a scientifically supported conclusion, you know, please list it in the comments section below. There's a bunch of ways to contact me in the details section below, including a Discord channel, which is pretty cool. And if you like what I have to say and you want to just see a bunch of different pictures and writings and videos that are only found in one place, then you can check out my Patreon for as little as $1 a month, which is pretty rad. But as always, thanks for listening.